You know of quarterbacks. You've probably watched The Hunchback. Maybe you've ridden horseback. But do you know what feedback is? Feedback is a response. In the classroom, feedback helps the learners to maximize their potential at different stages of training. It raises awareness of the student's strengths, areas for improvement, and identifies actions to be taken to improve performance. Bill Gates said, "We all need feedback. That's how we improve." Feedback is an ongoing thing that occurs during the learning process. The teachers like to give feedback when they model and explain, through guided practice, so on and so forth. Pretty much any time during the learning process, you can find feedback going on. There are two types of feedback. You have informal and formal. Informal feedback, it's going to happen during the learning process. Examples of informal feedback may include checking on students as they're working. Teachers may answer questions. They may make suggestions for the students. Teachers may jot down notes to help the students during the learning process. For example, they may write notes in a journal that the student has, or perhaps even on a written paper itself, or give verbal feedback during a performance. Also, allowing students to correct their work along the way is another form of feedback. And of course, you have peer-to-peer feedback. Let's talk about that peer-to-peer feedback for just a minute. It can also be very constructive. All feedback does not have to come from the instructor. Before this takes place, however, the professor or instructor needs to make sure that certain areas are addressed. First, you need to make sure that there's very clear instruction on how to give feedback. Secondly, the teacher should model what good feedback is. And after a student completely understands what good feedback is, then during the process of the peer-to-peer feedback sessions, the teacher needs to make sure they hold the student accountable for their participation. Otherwise, if you're not making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, the feedback is completely useless. Now, formal feedback is another form. It usually occurs during the summative assessment process or after the learning has occurred. An example of a formal assessment feedback would be, for example, a teacher-student feedback conference. What does this look like? Well, first of all, the teacher has to first overview the student's work. Secondly, the teacher needs to make sure they prepare a specific list of constructive criticisms for their work. Next, the teacher needs to focus on 2 or 3 items, citing exactly how to improve. Now, this needs to be done in a basic way. First of all, you don't want to just give all critical feedback that sounds like the student butchered their paper. You want to make sure you sandwich the good in with the bad. Make sure you've got some positive comments to go along with the negative comments. Next, allow the students to ask questions during this exchange. Finally, once the exchange is over, make sure that you allow the student to take that written feedback with them so that they can reflect. It's very important. In fact, this is one of the most engaging parts of the whole learning process is student reflection during learning. What does effective feedback look like? Well, first of all, it's clear. The teacher makes sure their instruction is chunked in small chunks so that it's easily digestible for the students. Secondly, it's timely. It's quick. The sooner a student gets the feedback, the better. Teachers may use technology to aid in this process because technology, as we know, tends to quicken things. It also needs to be corrective. For example, it's not enough to say, "Good job," or, "Well, that paper that you wrote was rather weak." That's not good enough feedback. It needs to be corrective. Tell the student why it wasn't good or why it was good, and tell them how to make it better or how that their performance on their assignment was good and what they did and how they made it better. Next, it needs to be ongoing. You need to make sure that you're continually holding students accountable for your expectations in the classroom on different assignments and making sure what they're doing is leading toward their learning goals. Next, the feedback should be specific. Make sure you're not giving vague instructions or vague feedback. If you do, what you're going to find is you're going to have a wide array of student work that's not as specific as you're probably hoping it would be, and you're going to spend a lot of time reteaching and trying to steer the students back to your main learning goal. Next, it needs to be consistent. And what I mean by this is the feedback should be accurate, it should be reliable, it should be steady. Make sure that you have a way to do that. A rubric is a very good way to make sure that your feedback is consistent from one student to the next. Next, the feedback should also be goal-centered. And what I mean is make sure the feedback that you're giving is tied into the student's learning goal. Otherwise, if it doesn't tie into the learning goal, maybe you need to consider why you're giving that feedback in the first place. And finally, you need to allow time for the students to reflect. This particular step encourages the students to think about what changes need to be made and how they should also be made. The feedback cycle is unending as long as we are engaged in the learning process. The first step of the feedback cycle is to discover the issues that need to be addressed. Secondly, you analyze the cause or consequences, the things that need to be worked on, and how they need to be worked on would be the next step. Create the options or solutions to the problem. Next, have the student commit to the action and make those changes. And finally, that student's going to bring before the teacher, once again, their work to be examined. The teacher's going to evaluate their performance and their improvements. And again, that cycle starts over once again. Like I said, the feedback cycle is ongoing as long as the learning process is taking place. Now, there are times when there are barriers to feedback. We're going to talk about some of those today. The first barrier to feedback is when a teacher has a fear of offending a student, which may entail hurting their relationship. A way to avoid this particular problem is make sure that you are a teacher who has immediacy with their students. The closer you are with your student, the more likely they are to be responsive and listen to you. Secondly, you may run across a student who is very defensive in their reaction to your feedback. So you want to make sure as you're giving feedback to your students that it is appropriate, what you're saying, and it's also very empathetic. Make sure that you're not just focusing on the bad. You make sure you sprinkle some good in with the bad so the student doesn't feel like you're just continually putting them down and making them feel like they can't do a good enough job. There's always a positive anytime you give feedback to a student. And finally, if a teacher is giving inconsistent and generalized feedback, then it's going to be completely useless. It's going to, in fact, hinder the improvement process. You make sure you tell your students why it needs to be fixed and how to fix it, and you make sure, again, you hold those students accountable to your expectations and that they're working toward their learning goal. A biblical perspective on feedback is, number one, God is a teacher. He's constantly giving feedback to his children. God's Word is also an instruction book that is very clear, very consistent, and very specific feedback for us. He also gives lots of examples in the Bible of people who model what he wants and people who model what he did not want. He gives us ongoing feedback throughout our lives as we grow in him. As well, he allows time for us to reflect and to change. And of course, as he's giving feedback, he's reteaching us. He's giving us opportunities to retake our assessments, whether that be in obedience or faithfulness, whatever the assessment is, he gives us opportunities to retake and focus on what we need to work on. And in conclusion, I would say feedback is like a dance. Communicating feedback is a naturally occurring phenomenon in the classroom. And it can work like two fluid dancers, each responding and complementing one another as the learning process transpires. So maybe you know of quarterbacks. You've watched The Hunchback, and perhaps you rode horseback. But now, you can add knowing what feedback is to that list.